And we are back on the Zero Hour. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, your host, and joining me once again is my friend Matt Taibbi. You know Matt from his writing, first at Rolling Stone, and first at The Exile, Rolling Stone, now at Taibbi.substack.com, at TK News, as well as other outlets. He also still has Useful Idiots, the podcast, which he and sometimes Aaron Mate co-host with Katie Halper. And he has a recent piece, of course, a number of books, which I encourage you to read all of them sequentially. And he joins us now.
In hardback, buy the hardbacks.
Buy the hardback. I think he gets a bit of a royalty. I'm not sure. And forget Kindle. And he joins us now to talk about at least one of his recent pieces that struck me for a variety of reasons, hopefully we'll get into, which was called The New Kremlinology. And it was basically, well, he can tell us, but it was entitled The New Kremlinology, Reading the New York Times. So first of all, Matt, thanks for coming back on the program.
No, thanks for having me, Richard. It's a pleasure. It's been a while.
Yeah, it really has been a while. And speaking of been a while, you know what your piece made me think of, Matt, was when I was in high school, which was, trust me, years ago, my older brother had a great teacher. He was a novelist and sometimes journalist, brilliant guy named Chandler Broussard, who pissed off everybody there was to piss off in the literary worlds. And, you know, it became kind of a pariah, kind of like we are now, actually. And he taught a course on reading the New York Times.
That's a great course.
Phenomenal. And particularly back in the 70s, right?
Right.
And or whenever it was. And he would actually just every day, and I got to visit it a couple times, open the New York Times and like say, see why this article's here and that article's there and what it means when he says this. And, I went and visited those 2 visits or whatever that I made when I was like 16. They really shaped my thinking in a lot of ways.
Wow.
Yeah. And that was back when it was heretical to think in any way that was before Judy Miller and the run up to the invasion of Iraq and curveball and all of that stuff.
Right.
But your piece, The New Kremlinology, reading the New York Times, was, I thought, a kind of brilliant in the same spirit, sort of decoding of how the signaling that we can find in the spirit of the late Chandler Broussard, of how really we may not get actual, sometimes we do get news from New York Times and perhaps the Washington Post as well, but what we really get from them is a kind of, well, I'll tell you another story in a minute too about that, but you really liken it to Pravda and that sort of Soviet era. And of course, you were over there, the decline of the Soviet era.
I worked in the building, the Pravda building.
Did you really?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And so tell us a little bit about the piece, The New Kremlinology, and what caused you to draw this parallel.
So first of all, that the Chandler's course sounds great. That's I wish I could have taken that. I actually years ago was going to do something similar. I used to do like this parlor trick with friends where I would take a page of the New York Times and then as fast as I could, like with under a minute, find like 10 lies on the front page. So I'd take like a red pen and a copy of the Times. And I thought I would like do that as a performance art type of thing at one point, but never panned out. But the Times has always fascinated me. I mean, look, there's always been this element of reading between the lines. I think if you read a book like Manufacturing Consent, by Noam Chomsky, it teaches you how to read the newspaper and understand the context of what they're trying to tell you in addition to what they're saying in the actual text. But I think what's happened in recent years is that it's because so many things are off limits to talk about, or because there's so much political calculation in the reporting in a way that probably wasn't there as much previously. You really now have to kind of read between the lines to understand what are they really telling me with these news stories. Just to take an example, the Times in the last couple of weeks suddenly had this flood of stories about Joe Biden's health, with headlines like Biden is testing the limits of age and infirmity or something like that. I forget what the headline read. And is Biden too old to be president? There were guest essays, and they hadn't done that for years. Even these were all fertile topics to explore during the campaign, but why are we getting it now? Well, the real reason for that is, if you know how the business works, is that it's a bunch of people in Washington who are probably in the Democratic Party who are probably calling these reporters, and they want to put it out there that, we're throwing Biden overboard, or we want to see how that goes over, one or the other, right? And it's just a different way to read the news than what we're accustomed to in the States. I think normally that subject would have been explored much more thoroughly during the campaign, and now we get it at a different time.
What's interesting about that, Matt, is that not only wasn't it explored during the primary, which, as you say, if the purpose of a newspaper like the New York Times was to inform the electorate, which is what we're always told in school, right? The purpose of the press is to inform the electorate so that they can make knowledgeable decisions about who to vote for president. The logical time to tell the people about any questions about Joe Biden's or anybody's cognitive abilities would be during the election. The fact that we were not only not told, we were actually told that we were bad human beings for having any question about it. You quote a couple, I think Sullenberger, Captain Sullenberger, you mentioned a piece of his, I'd forgotten about it till I read your piece about, I stutter too, I dare you to quit. It's kind of like you're a piece of crap if you even bring up Joe Biden stutter. You're the kid, you're the schoolyard bully making fun of the stuttering kid if you question it, when in fact people who question Joe Biden's cognition, as I did, were not doing so. I didn't question Joe Biden's cognition in 2008. I saw him occasionally stutter, but I actually thought he was a smart in terms of, he was fast with a one-liner. His one-liner about Rudy Giuliani, his favorite noun, a verb, and 9/11, a good line. He could deliver a line. I didn't have those problems back then, so I wasn't making fun of a lifelong stutter. I had concerns in 2018. Those were not, 2020. Those were not, stuttering concerns. That was something else. So, but this idea that not only no, he doesn't have a problem, we're not going to report on the non-problem. And if you bring it up as if it is a problem, you're ableist and a bad person. That is really groupthink, isn't it?
Yeah, it's really creepy, and as you say, it's kind of alien to the news mission. Theoretically, we don't care, whether or not he has what the political import of him, possibly having a cognition issue would be. I think what happened during the campaign, and I know this because I talked to some of the people who were covering him. I followed him for a little while. A lot of us saw him in 2008. We saw the clear difference. As you say, he was quick. He always seemed prescient, although he did sometimes have trouble speaking. Sometimes he would kind of accelerate unnecessarily, or his emotional tenor would be sometimes not match the speech. Like the register would be angry when it was supposed to be inspiring. It would be off somehow. But in 2020, it was a completely different issue. It clearly had to do with things like not being aware where he was, being unable to control impulses like anger with people, forgetting where he was in the middle of a sentence. It wasn't a speech issue. Although that I'm sure that complicated it, right? But I think what a lot of the reporters are saying to each other was, well, if we talk about this, then it's going to hurt his chances against Trump. And part of our mission now is to make sure that Trump doesn't win. So let's sit on this. But what ended up happening, I think that ends up becoming a problem of credibility for the newspaper, which makes it more difficult to report on things and have an impact on the public overall.
Yeah. And I also think it's a dereliction of responsibility. And, just to be clear, in terms of my own conflict of interest, although it's overstating the case, I worked for Bernie Sanders in 2015, 2016. When issues of his age came up, I gave him a line to use, which he did use, which was, if you have any concerns about my age, questions about my age, come out with me for a day on the campaign trail and see if you can keep up. And I gave him that line, which he used because I found it hard to keep up. Yeah, yeah. Man, yeah, it definitely was. On the other hand, so, I didn't like it as a campaign staffer when people questioned his age, but on the other hand, legitimate. And in 2020, I didn't work for him, but when he had a heart attack, heart problem, of course, you're going to bring that up. You gotta, it's part of the job as a journalist. So, but what struck me was, of course, they didn't just conceal this when Biden was facing Trump, and it's wrong even at that point. They concealed it when he was facing Bernie as well.
Right.
Don't you think? That's my recollection. Isn't that right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. As I talk about in the piece, the same experts who called me, they called me to talk about Trump being mentally unfit during the big push to have Trump removed under the 25th Amendment. You remember there was kind of a media furor about that. Those people didn't, when I called them back, even to consult off the record, like I tried it all different ways to try to get advice on, what are you seeing in Biden? Does he also have a physical impairment issue? They wouldn't comment for the record, wouldn't talk to me. So this was something that it was very much on the QT during the primary and during the general election. I understand it a little bit more during the general, but even then, I think it's, for a reporter, it's always bad news when you just consciously avoid a story, because it ends up coming back to bite you. It's similar to the way reporters non-reported the sort of Hillary's sparse crowds in 2016. Nobody really wanted to talk about it, but it ended up being an issue, and a signal that there was real trouble ahead.
Yeah, Matt Taibbi, you got a little ahead of your interview there. I was going to bring up those psychiatrists. I found it fascinating because I had a little bit of problem. I'm not a doctor or psychiatrist. I'm not really super familiar with the professional ethics, but I read them when people started diagnosing Trump at a distance. I remember when people were diagnosing Nixon at a distance, and it seemed to me to be a violation of professional ethics, but a lot of people were eager to do it. Mary Trump, his niece, who was in that field, I think she's a psychologist, if I recall correctly, she was eager to do it. Where she not only, she had a personal relationship, so it's a kind of double violation of ethics, but a lot of people were eager to do it. It struck me that if it was legitimate for Trump, it was, if anything, much more so legitimate looking at Biden just from a distance, as we all are, reminded me of the old Henny Youngman joke. Henny Youngman, there are no new Henny Youngman jokes, I acknowledge that, but
that's a good point.
Henny Youngman had a joke about going to the racetrack where he said, some people bet their horse to win, some people bet their horse to show. I should have bet that horse to live. And I hate to say it, but, wanting Biden to beat Trump, that's kind of how I felt about him at certain points during I should be betting him to live. But I was very worried about his health, physical and mental, during that race. He seems to be holding up okay, and I'm happy for that. I will, on a personal level, I wish him the best. But it certainly seems to me, if you're a psychiatrist like the ones you've contacted that demurred from even saying anything in private, I don't get where their ethics are. Because if you're willing to pronounce on the mental health of Donald Trump, who seems, if anything, more able to construct a coherent, if horrific sentence, why can't you at least off the record say what offer an interpretation? The only thing I can take away from that is that as a psychiatrist, you're a Biden supporter and you have genuine concerns. But I don't know. How do you read that? It seems unethical.
Yeah, that was one of the first moments for me where I realized that the media environment had changed to a point where I was going to have a problem going forward, because just the way we report the news now is just different, and it's even reached sources who are thinking about the political impact of what they say over just giving you the information, even off the record, which is just so different from the way I'm used to operating. And reporters are going along with it too. It's what's so interesting about this recent flood of stories in the Times also is, again, what are they really telling you by the sudden appearance of all these stories about Biden's health? Well, they're telling you that there's been a big shift somewhere in the Democratic Party, that people are thinking differently in terms of strategy about 2024. We don't think he can do it. We're going to maybe have somebody like Gavin Newsom or J.B. Pritzker step in. They actually explicitly talked about that in the Washington Post. But so they're clearly having those conversations with the reporters, but the reporters aren't reporting that. What they're doing is they're reporting the phony narrative, suddenly we're gonna decide now that it's okay to talk about Biden's health. And that's essentially what those news stories, what their function was publicly, which is very Soviet, right? It's you're allowed to talk about this now, right? And they've done this with a number of different issues, some of them on more the social justice track recently, where they did a gigantic deep dive into the trans healthcare for kids. Where they expounded on issues that had been completely taboo in their pages for a long time. So that's really what they're telling you. They're telling you more when it's okay to talk about something, as opposed to what the actual information is, which is just a very strange way to think about the news. You and I both grew up in a completely different environment, right? So it's very odd.
It really is. And I guess, in trying to parse and in reading your piece, at first with this Biden coverage, my initial reaction was, well, maybe there's just blood in the water, right? His poll numbers are so bad, and majority of Democrats want him out, that maybe they just smell blood in the water. So now it's time to do the get rid of Joe stories that they couldn't do before. But you convinced me, first of all, with these anonymous sources talking about J.B. Pritzker. God, who, they're throwing that guy out. It blows my mind. But him and Newsom and all that, just kind of trial balloon names being put out there. Michelle Goldberg's Joe Biden is too old to be president. And it does have the feeling of a coordinated campaign. Then you pivot to, and I did want to talk about this, you say, I love this line, this sentence, is half a sentence actually. What we've got is a newspaper that catches real history spasmodically and often years late, but has the accuracy of an atomic clock when it comes to recording the shifting attitudes of elite opinion. Yeah, that's very true. Public often learns about key facts, pressing international controversies, or trends in American thoughts only once these are deemed suitable for public consumption. Hunter Biden, you have to almost read backwards from the stories they print to learn that it's finally been acknowledged 2 years later that really was Hunter Biden's laptop. We've talked about that before. I mean, that is definitely a sort of police state story in the way that was handled. But you mentioned a couple of things, Emily Bazelon's piece. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right.
I think that's right, yeah.
Yeah, The Battle Over Genital Therapy, Michael Powell, A Vanishing Word in the Abortion Debate, Women. What are those pieces telling us?
Well, both of those pieces are really about the trans issue. So it would have been, I think, taboo previously to suggest that there was any kind of conflict between the interests of women and the trans lobby, which is what that Powell piece is about. The vanishing word and the abortion debate, women, because there are women who feel that this is an issue that is about them, not about people who have the capacity to have abortions or whatever it is. And so again, this is the time saying, well, we're going to allow you to talk about that issue now. And the same thing with the Bazelon piece. The Bazelon piece was very similar to some other stories that have been done by journalists like Jesse Singal and Katie Herzog, that got both of those two essentially canceled to the point where they're now doing a podcast together very successfully. But they were out in the wilderness for a long time for doing really the same kind of stuff that's in the Times piece. There are a few rhetorical differences in there, but a lot of it is the same information about stuff that you couldn't say before. Like, for instance, they just flatly say in that piece, Lupron, the puberty blockers, have long-term, lasting, permanent effects on kids. Right? And that you couldn't say that. That was transphobic 10 minutes ago. It's very, again, this part of this is because I have a background in living in Russia, and I actually knew some of those guys who worked in places like Komsomolskaya Pravda or Izvestia. And this is what they were doing. Their job was to take information and kind of between the lines give people messages about what they could talk about.
So and then we'll go back to this, but right after World War II, my parents weren't even married yet, but they worked at a communist summer camp in the Catskills called Camp Unity. And 1 week, the staff there elected my mom Miss Worker, and she was small, physically small. So they put her in one of those big, like, serving trays that has like a dome over it. And they brought her out and then opened it. It was totally sight. And she was in a bathing suit with
a sash.
Sash. Yeah, that's the word I'm looking for. And anyway, my dad was directing the stage show, and they used to have a little musical, and they'd say, says Comrade so-and-so, says Comrade Stalin, says Comrade Tito. But every week he'd get a memo, Tito's out. And that's also what this has all made me think of.
Totally.
But, on the trans issue, see, I read that. And by the way, it's a very tough issue to navigate because, for example, with the Alito decision and then with the final decision, I got hit for and I've covered trans issues with trans guests since 2014. But I got hit for referring to it as a setback for women and other people who get pregnant for putting women first. I got hit for describing it as a setback for people who get pregnant for not, I get it. It's a very charged issue. But I took those articles that you mentioned as an indication that the Democrats, now this is just speculation, correct me if you think I'm nuts, but I took it as an indication that the Democrats are growing concerned that—
I agree with you. I know where you're going, but
you know where I'm going, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Pregnant people language, et cetera, is going to hurt them in the midterms.
Absolutely. I think the Democrats know that they're looking at the numbers. I'm sure they're running focus groups, right? and little exchanges like that thing that happened last week between, which member of Congress was it, who asked the
I'm
Harvard
blanking.
professor, if she meant women when she was saying people who can get pregnant. But that stuff, everybody on Twitter thought that
That
the
the
Harvard
professor
professor
won, right? Yeah,
won that
yeah.
exchange. But I think if you polled most people, it would be like 90-10 the other way. And I think the Democrats, I agree. I think they're concerned about just some of the more out there language, and Republicans just running on that. They really won't have to do a whole lot of work. They'll just have to put a few people who scare, middle America a little bit. A lot of people don't even know what they're talking about when you refer to, people who can get pregnant. That's not a term that everybody in America understands or is familiar with. So, and I think in the same way, like that's what happened in Virginia. It was there was just a lot of stuff that was going on in schools that freaked people out, and they put it out there, and I think it made a big difference with independent voters, and then with other kinds of demographics that were a little bit of a surprise too, like South Asian voters, right? They flipped significantly in Virginia, right? And so Democrats know that. I think you're right. I think they see that, and they're trying to move the dialogue in a certain direction. But that's going to be difficult to pull off. To keep the various wings of the party together is going to be a difficult feat.
Yeah, I do think it represents a challenge. And, it is interesting to me how the Times reflects that thinking so lockstep. And lastly, and lastly, before we go, you just published a piece, The Great American Military Rebrand. I should preface it by saying that I looked it up. On my father's side, I actually do qualify for Ukrainian citizenship.
Wow.
So I expect to be treated with special deference in the American media from now on. What I say goes. But this is, I'm so old, as Ed McMahon used to say on the Johnny Carson show. I'm so old that I can remember when the left actually questioned the military narrative rather than, embracing Lockheed Martin as the heroes of American industry. But just briefly, it basically has the left become the salespeople for the military industrial complex?
Yeah, I think that's the thesis that I'm sort of playing around with here, is this idea that, after the neoconservative project fizzled out, right, the Iraq War turns out to be a fiasco. The nation building project turns out to be a fiasco. It costs not only Bush and the Republicans, but Hillary Clinton, the election in 2008. So the military industrial complex, I think, needed to rebrand itself. It faced for the first time in a long time cuts in 2011. And I think what you've seen since then, since the middle Obama years, is this steady rebrand of what the military is for. Our interventions have more and more overtly been framed as humanitarian in nature or designed to overturn regressive political actors, whether it's Assad or Gaddafi, or even a warlord like Joseph Kony, or the Taliban, because they squelch women's rights. So they've pretty seamlessly taken a lot of the same themes that were hammered by people like Ari Fleischer and Dick Cheney and Bush and David Frum, and they've just kind of shifted the language a little bit to say things like, well, we can't normalize Assad. And basically you have the Bushian doctrine of, needing to end tyranny around the world. but it's rewritten as a new kind of progressive project. And I think they've been very successful at that, which has been reflected obviously in these massive budget hikes under Biden, which are just historic. But you're right. I'm also old enough to remember that being anti-war at one point was like a required element of being on the left, and now I think it's very far. It feels like it's very far down the list of concerns to me. I don't know.
And it doesn't seem as if outcomes or any part of the conversation are on the left. I mean, the argument seemed to be that we needed to invade Afghanistan so that girls could go to elementary school. Now girls can't go to school and they're starving to death. And
right.
Nobody's saying, well, that didn't work. Instead, we're upping the budget. So I remain astonished at the amount of bitter arguments I'm having in public and in private with people who are probably, if they're old enough, 40 years ago or whatever, we're probably marching with, hell no, I won't go signs. So, okay, last question. I know you got to go, Matt, but we're first and foremost journalists, but do you ever get discouraged and just think, what the hell? Things aren't getting any better. This is bullshit.
I mean, I would say I'm a little nervous now in ways that I've never really been before. Like I lived in the post-Soviet universe, so I saw what happens when a massive industrial superpower collapses. Like I was there for that, watching it happen. I remember this day when they devalued the ruble, so people who had been holding their money in their mattresses, they're saving up their whole lives, and suddenly, like in a snap, it was worthless. People just stumbled onto the street and they were just dazed, and America, it is fraying at the edges in ways that make you worry about that kind of scenario, right? I think frankly, as much as I think some of the Trump coverage is overblown, is this whole idea of, tests of our democracy. That there's a real element to that. I am nervous about it. I think people are ready to throw down in civil conflict in ways they've never been willing to do before, which really makes me. I don't know. How do you feel about it? Because I'm more pessimistic now about that kind of stuff than I ever have been.
I'm more pessimistic than I've ever been. And I was in the fringes of empire when that happened in Hungary and Poland. And I saw people just, assembling private armies, and, the gas station on the corner in my girlfriend's neighborhood, all of a sudden it's taken over by thugs. And it's like, this is ours now. And the factory where she worked, okay, these guys are taking it now. And it's just like, okay. And they're oligarchs and they're running things now. Okay, I can see something like that happening for sure. So I'm kind of worried, but, I always quote Antonio Gramsci, pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. But I tend to think we're in for potentially a rocky ride for a while.
Yeah. And Americans aren't, other countries have a tradition where they've dealt with stuff like that before, upheaval, displacement, things not working, infrastructure collapsing. Like that's a thing that other countries have histories of. We don't. Maybe the Depression is probably the closest thing we've had to just sort of a total collapse. But as you say, the kind of things that you're describing, I remember seeing somebody just basically putting a blockade across a highway in in one of the Siberian regions because he just created his own toll booth. Because if you have your own gun, and you're in the middle of nowhere, like, what are people going to do? And that's the kind of stuff that people in this country just don't. They have no idea how bad it can get. And I worry about that too, just because America has always been such a stable place compared to everywhere else in the world.
And I think people either pull together at that point or they turn on each other. And we don't have any tradition of that. So I don't know which we'll do. But, I had to get out of Hungary. They said, get out And I said, well, I have a ticket on Saturday. There's no tonight. And well, we have no place to go because we're Americans. So, we shall see.
Yeah, scary. Yeah,
Yep.
we will see. But anyway, well, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
It's a pleasure. Again, my guest has been Matt Taibbi, and look forward to the next time. And as always, thanks for your great work. And as always, thanks for coming on the program.
Right, thanks, Richard. Take care.
And we'll be right back after this. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is the Zero Hour.